The first Viet Cong fighter never even knew the rifle existed. All he heard was the faint click of a safety sliding off somewhere out in the tree line, swallowed almost immediately by the damp air. Then a single sharp crack tore through the humid silence, and he collapsed without a word, dropping straight down into the grass on the far edge of the clearing. The others thought it was a stray round from his own side, from somewhere else on the ridge, from a nervous trigger finger. It didn't matter. They were focused on the American patrol pinned down in the dry creek bed below, not on the unseen man lying perfectly still 250 yards away with a rifle practically everyone in his own unit had laughed at. Sergeant Mark Harlow watched the man fall through a haze of heat mirage rising from the red Vietnamese dirt. He didn't celebrate. He didn't whisper a curse. He didn't move his cheek from the worn spot on the rifle stock where it had rested for the last 40 minutes. Sweat trickled down the side of his face, stinging his eye, but he ignored it. One target, one shot. One less set of eyes scanning the creek bed for his men. The next move belonged to the enemy. He waited. Clockwork. That was how he thought of them after months in this sector. They were disciplined, patient, clever, but they were predictable when they thought they had the advantage. And right now, with Charlie Company trapped in the shallow cut of the creek and machine gun fire raking back and forth just above their helmets, the Viet Cong were certain the advantage was theirs. Someone on the far tree line shouted an order. The machine gun fire slowed, then stopped completely, replaced by bursts of single shots probing the creek bed. Harlow heard bullets snap over the dry channel as the Viet Cong tried to pin down specific positions. He could imagine the men below him pressed into the dirt, counting breaths between impacts, waiting for anything to change. He adjusted the focus on his scope ever so slightly and let his eye roam along the distant shadows. There, a muzzle glint, half a helmet, the brief flash of a hand signaling. A squad leader, maybe more. He tracked the motion, feeling the rifle become an extension of the slow, measured breath in his chest. They had told him this rifle had no place in Vietnam, that it was too old, too slow, too civilian. It was a bolt-action he'd brought from home on a technicality and a loophole in American hunting rifle chambered in a heavy caliber, with a scope older than some of the privates in his company. When he'd pulled it out of the case on his first day in country, a few of the other sergeants had smirked. "You plan on shooting deer out here, Harlow?" One of them had joked. "Charlie doesn't stand still and pose for you, but Harlow hadn't cared. Back in Montana, that rifle had put meat on the table for his family for years. It had taught him how to read distance, how to see wind in the way grass leaned, how to feel the give of a trigger in the cold before dawn. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't new. It didn't fire 3-round bursts. It fired once. And when he did his part, once was enough. He exhaled slowly, letting the crosshairs settle on the thin slice of shadow between two tree trunks where the squad leader had last flashed into view. Patience. The battlefield below him was loud. M16S spitting back in blind reply from the creek, the occasional shout of reloading. Carried on the heavy air, but up here, tucked into the shallow depression on the hillside with brush piled in front of him, the sound felt distant. His world had narrowed to the circle of glass in front of his eye and the beat of his own heart. The squad leader leaned out again, raising his head just enough to bark another command. Harlow squeezed, the rifle bucked into his shoulder. Dust puffed from the distant tree line and the figure dropped out of sight. 2. He worked the bolt by habit, hand moving without thought. The shell casing flicked to the side and disappeared into the grass. He didn't watch it, his eye never left the scope. Already the rhythm of the enemy fire was changing. Without their leader's hand signals, the volume faltered. The machine gun didn't come back online, that was good. The men in the creek bed needed that breathing room, even if they didn't understand why it was happening. Harlow shifted his aim slightly left, scanning. There was a boulder near the edge of the tree line, the same one he'd marked when he settled into his firing position. It had seemed unimportant than just another piece of terrain. Now he saw a shape pressed flat against it, angled to watch the creek. The barrel of an SKS rifle protruded a fraction too far, the metal dark against the lighter gray of stone. The useless rifle spoke again. The SKS dropped. 3. Down below in the creek bed, Lieutenant Harper was trying to pull order out of chaos. Harlow could see him through a gap in the brush. Pressed against the eroded side of the channel, helmet low, hand gripping the handset of a radio that stubbornly refused to reach anyone who could help. Harper had been in country for 3 weeks. Long enough to understand the heat, the insects, the constant feeling of being watched. Not long enough to accept that sometimes help didn't come. They had walked into the kill zone neat and clean, textbook formation along the low ground. The intelligence had said this valley was a transit corridor, not an ambush site. So when the first burst of automatic fire stitched the dirt in front of the point man and the air filled with the crack of rifles from the tree line, shock had done half the enemy's work for them. Harper's platoon had done what they were trained to do: find cover, return fire, try to establish fields of fire. But there was no real cover in a shallow creek bed, just the illusion of safety in a few inches of dirt. The machine gun up on the ridge had made sure of that, walking rounds along the edges of the channel, searching for heads too slow to duck. Harlow had been on overwatch, positioned high on the hillside to provide exactly this kind of support. At least that was what they'd written on the operations order. The truth was, no one had expected a single man with a bolt-action rifle to change the outcome of a full-on ambush. He was an extra set of eyes, insurance, nothing more. Now, as he watched the tree line through his scope, he knew that assumption was the only reason his platoon was still breathing. The enemy hadn't accounted for him. They had mapped the creek, plotted fields of fire sited in the rocks and scrub where they expected men to dive for cover. They had not imagined a lone marksman lying motionless 2 football fields away with a rifle they assumed no serious army still relied on. Another Viet Cong fighter moved into view, crawling forward to a new firing position. Harlow tracked him, waited, and then squeezed the trigger when the man paused to raise his rifle. 4. He did not think about the number. Not yet. He was counting for a different reason. The more bodies he dropped from that tree line, the more he disrupted their rhythm. Ambushes lived and died on rhythm. Once broken, they became something else. A gunfight. A test of will and endurance. And Americans were very good at those. Somewhere behind the tree line, a whistle shrilled. The remaining Viet Cong fighters shifted tactics. The random probing fire stopped. For several seconds, the battlefield held its breath. Harlow recognized the pattern. They were about to move, either to rush the flank of the creek bed or to reposition their machine gun. Either way, he had a decision to make. He curled his hand more firmly around the stock of the rifle they had dismissed as an antique and prepared to show everyone on that. Valley friends and enemies both just how wrong they had been. The whistle shrilled again, sharper this time, and the tree line erupted in motion. Shadows detached themselves from the undergrowth and began to flow toward the flanks of the creek bed, low and fast. Harlow tracked them, counting shapes, estimating angles. They weren't just spraying rounds from cover anymore. They were maneuvering, trying to close the noose around Harper's platoon before anyone could break contact. He shifted his aim to the far left, where a cluster of figures darted between trees. They were using bounding overwatch, 2 moving while 1 covered, then shifting roles. Disciplined, trained, dangerous. This was no half-hearted militia. These were seasoned fighters who knew the land better than anyone in Harper's platoon. If they reached the rocks overlooking the creek, they would be able to fire straight down into his men's backs. Harlow focused on the point man, watched the pattern of his movement, then fired when the man paused behind a stump to signal. The point man pitched forward, collapsing into the brush. 5. The 2 men behind him hesitated, their rhythm disrupted. One dove for cover, the other turned, trying to locate the source of the shot. Harlow shifted swiftly and fired again. The second man crumpled sideways, disappearing behind the roots of a fallen tree. 6. Below. Harper had finally begun to understand that something was happening he hadn't asked for but desperately needed. The volume of incoming fire from the tree line had dropped just enough to give his men breathing room. He risked a glance over the lip of the creek and saw flashes of movement near the base of the ridge. He didn't know Harlow's exact position. They hadn't rehearsed this scenario together, but he'd been told before stepping off that morning, if it goes bad, look up. Harlow will be somewhere high. So Harper looked up. He couldn't see the sniper, but he could see the effect. Men in dark pajamas dropping at the edge of the trees without any obvious source of fire. Brief gaps opening in what had been a solid wall of muzzle flashes. Harper grabbed the radio handset again, speaking low and fast. "This is Charlie 2-6. Unknown supporting element engaging tree line. We are still pinned, requesting immediate fire support. Over." The reply was a mess of static and distant voices. Somewhere miles away, someone was juggling too many calls at once. Artillery was already busy. Air support was limited. Harlow knew better than to wait on miracles from above. He settled the rifle again and went back to the only thing he could control. He swept the scope across the right flank. Another cluster of enemy fighters was moving there, slower but just as methodical. One carried something heavier across his shoulders, a long, angular shape Harlow recognized instantly. A crew-served weapon. They were trying to drag a second machine gun into position to rake the creek from a new angle. He took a breath, adjusted for distance, and squeezed. The man with the machine gun went down hard. The weapon slid off his shoulders and clattered onto the ground. One of his comrades scrambled to grab it, panic cutting through his movements. Harlow fired again. The second man dropped. 7. 8. Another fighter dove forward, desperate to reach the discarded weapon. Harlow let him. The man grabbed the gun, hauled it halfway up, and then paused just long enough for Harlow to put a round through his chest. 9. Harlow worked the bolt, feeling the smooth, familiar motion of steel on steel. The magazine was running lower now. He knew it without looking. He'd loaded carefully that morning, counting each round as he slid it into place. He had enough left for this fight if he stayed disciplined. No wild shots, no guesses. Every trigger pull had to matter. For a heartbeat, his mind drifted far from the Vietnamese hillside. He was 16 again, lying prone in the frostbitten grass of a Montana field with his father beside him. Both of them staring across 100 yards of open ground at a narrow silhouette between two pine trunks. "Don't chase it," his father had said quietly. "Let the world settle first. Breathe. Don't let the shot surprise you. Make friends with it." He hadn't understood then how those words would follow him here, to a valley half a world away where the stakes were no longer venison in winter stores, but the lives of 30 American soldiers pinned down in a dry creek. He came back to the present with a blink and a steadying breath. The world narrowed again to the circle of his scope. More figures were moving now, some dragging their wounded, others trying to reposition into cover. The clean ambush the Viet Cong had planned was dissolving into confusion. Men were shouting contradictory orders. Some fired wildly toward the hillsides, overcompensating for the unseen marksman. Harlow scanned for anyone who still seemed to be directing traffic. He found one, a man with a radio crouched behind a split trunk, head ducking in and out of view as he relayed instructions. Harlow watched his timing, then fired in the brief moment when the man leaned out too far. 10. The fighter collapsed onto the radio, knocking it sideways. For several seconds, no one picked it up. The rhythm broke entirely. Below, Harper saw his opening. "Shift fire left," he shouted. "Third squad, prep smoke. First and second squad, on my command, we're going to bound back by teams. We're not waiting for permission. We move now, or we die here." His men listened, not because his plan was perfect, but because they could feel the moment changing. The invisible hand on the tree line was buying them seconds. They hadn't had since the first rounds ripped the air apart. Seconds were enough. Colored smoke hissed and billowed along parts of the creek bed, creeping out and up toward the ridge. Visibility changed. Some enemy fighters shifted fire to the new plumes, wasting rounds on obscured shapes. Harlow adjusted his own aim, using the smoke as a backdrop to pick out dark silhouettes against lighter haze. He dropped another rifleman who had climbed halfway up a tree for a better angle. 11. He took out a grenadier who was trying to arc explosives into the creek. 12. He clipped the shoulder of a fighter who was attempting to climb over a rock to spot the sniper's position, spinning the man backward into cover. Not a kill, but enough to keep him down. The useless rifle bucked and whispered, each shot measured, each target chosen with deliberation. Harlow felt no thrill, no surge of triumph, only a deep, steady focus. Who's laughing at this rifle now? A small voice in the back of his head asked. He shut it out. There would be time later, if he lived, to argue with supply officers and weapons experts about what belonged on a modern battlefield. Right now, the only argument that mattered was the one playing out through his scope. Gradually, the enemy fire slackened. Not everywhere pockets of resistance held stubbornly, but enough that Harper's first team managed to break contact and sprint deeper along the creek bed to a safer position. The second team followed, leapfrogging back. A third team froze when a renewed burst of fire swept past. But Harlow cut down 2 more shooters to open a gap. 13, 14. He felt the rifle's weight more keenly now, felt every pound of the wood stock pressing into his shoulder and every ounce of recoil absorbing into tired muscle. But he did not let up. He could not. The battle had shifted, but it wasn't over. Not yet. The Viet Cong, realizing their carefully planned kill zone was collapsing, began to pull back in clumps. Some tried to carry their wounded. Others simply faded into the foliage, vanishing like ghosts. Harlow picked off the ones who lingered too long, who tried to rally small counterattacks. 15, 16, 17, he did not know in that moment that someone would later put those numbers into an after-action report, tally and confirmed kills against an estimate of enemy strength. He did not know that officers would shake their heads in disbelief when they saw a line item like single marksman 27 enemy Kier disrupted ambush, enabled platoon withdrawal. He only knew that as long as the tree line spat metal toward his men, his work was not done. Down in the creek, Harper's voice grew hoarse from shouting commands. His men were moving now, their withdrawal no longer a panicked scramble but a controlled, if desperate, retreat. Each bound carried them farther from the center of the ambush. closer to the cover of a rocky outcropping where the terrain tilted in their favor. Harlow took one more shot at a figure who rose to fire from behind a tree, watched him drop, and then finally let his cheek come off the rifle stock for the first time in what felt like hours. He blinked, eyes burning. The battle's sounds were changing. The heavy pounding urgency of the ambush was turning into something else: sporadic shots. Shouts growing faint, the dull echo of movement receding. He rolled his shoulders slowly, feeling the stiffness set in. He knew one thing with absolute clarity. This valley wasn't done with them yet. Harlow eased himself back from the rifle just far enough to stretch his cramped neck. His body protested the movement, stiffness clawing at his spine. He'd been lying in the same shallow depression for hours, though his mind refused to assign time to the fight. In combat, minutes stretched and snapped in strange ways. What mattered now wasn't how long he'd been here. What mattered was that the fight down in the valley was evolving into something messier, and messy fights had a way of reaching out and dragging in everyone nearby. He slid the rifle forward again and peered through the scope. The tree line where the ambush had started was no longer the solid wall of threat it had been. Gaps showed where men no longer fired, where shapes had fallen and not risen. But farther back, deeper into the trees, he caught flashes of movement. The Viet Cong were pulling away from the kill zone, yes, but some weren't withdrawing, they were repositioning. He saw two figures drop to one knee near a boulder, their heads close together as they studied the landscape below. One gestured toward the hillside where Harlow lay. The other shaded his eyes with his hand, scanning up the slope. Harlow had known this moment would come. No matter how well hidden he was, no matter how carefully he managed muzzle blast and movement, the pattern would eventually become clear. Someone, somewhere on that tree line, would realize that the invisible hand tearing holes in their formation wasn't a coincidence. He watched them a second longer. One raised a pair of battered binoculars. Harlow exhaled slowly and settled the crosshairs on the narrow gap between the glass and the man's brow. As he squeezed the trigger, the man fell backward, binoculars spinning away in a brief flash. 18. The second man spun toward the source of the shot, eyes widening. He shouted something Harlow couldn't hear over the distance, pointing toward the slope. Harlow shifted, adjusting for the man's rapid movement, and let another round fly. The man folded over, clutching his chest, and went down. 19. He worked the bolt automatically, but this time he did glance at the magazine. Fewer rounds left than he liked. He'd planned for a long day, but not for a full-scale solo contest with an entire Viet Cong element. Still, he wasn't out yet. The men in the creek bed were no longer pinned. They were moving in bounds, pulling themselves out of the worst of it. If he could just keep the enemy from rallying again, from launching a final push, this might end with more Americans walking than being carried. He scanned the tree line again and noticed something new. Movement not coming toward the creek, but angling up and along the slope. A smaller group this time, for maybe 5 fighters, moving cautiously, crouched low, weapons held tight. So they weren't watching the valley, they were watching the hillside. Watching him. Of course, he muttered under his breath. You're not stupid. He'd been decisive and dangerous enough to become a problem that needed solving. The Viet Cong weren't content to trade bodies in the valley while some ghost on the hill plucked off anyone who tried to stand still. They were sending a hunting party to deal with him. He slid lower behind the brush, reducing his profile. From this angle, he could still see the group as they zigzagged between rocks and trees, using every scrap of cover. They moved with the same discipline he'd seen in the ambush. Not a disorganized mob, a unit. They watched each other's sectors. They paused, listened, scanned. They were professionals. He took a breath and considered his options. He could stay here and pick them off one by one as they advanced, but the closer they got, the more they'd be able to isolate his position with muzzle flashes and sound. And if even one of them closed the distance far enough to throw a grenade into his hide, it wouldn't matter how many he'd dropped from 200 yards. The battle would end the same way for him, fast and ugly. He needed to move. The thought was almost foreign after hours of absolute stillness. But the principles his father had drilled into him while hunting applied just as much here. A good shooter found a good position. A great shooter knew when to leave it. He backed away from the brush inch by inch, careful not to snap any twigs or disturb any larger branches. The hillside behind him sloped gently upward for another 20 yards before cresting in a rocky lip. If he could crawl up and over that lip, he'd have a second firing position overlooking the same valley from a different angle. The enemy, fixated on his old location, would be chasing a ghost. He moved slowly, dragging his body along the shallow depression, keeping his rifle cradled against his chest. His heart thudded louder in his ears than any distant gunfire. Every rustle of grass felt too loud, every shift of his boots an alarm. He imagined the Viet Cong advance team moving closer with each breath, tightening the noose. When he reached the base of the rock lip, he paused and risked one quick glance back toward his old hide. Through the leaves he saw them, for dark shapes inching along his former line of fire, weapons trained ahead. One pointed toward the brush he'd just vacated, another dropped to a knee, aiming at the spot where Harlow's head had been minutes earlier. If he'd stayed, he'd be dead already. He swallowed the thought and focused on the climb. The rock wasn't high, but it was uneven, jagged, with small ledges and cracks, enough to get a grip if he moved carefully. He slung the rifle over his shoulder, fingers searching for holds, boots planting in shallow grooves. His muscles burned, not from exertion alone, but from the long hours of static tension finally coming due. He pulled himself up, chest scraping against the stone, and rolled over the top into a small hollow on the far side. From here, the angle on the valley was different, higher, slightly offset, with a clearer line on the tree line's deeper positions. He could still see the Viet Cong hunters near his old spot, but now he looked down at them from above and behind. He slid the rifle back into place, settled his cheek onto the stock, and reacquired the nearest target. One of the fighters stood partially upright, gesturing toward the brush, likely reporting that the hide appeared empty. Harlow let out a slow breath and squeezed. 20. The man dropped where he stood, and the others dove for cover, scrambling behind rocks and tree trunks. They fired wildly toward the spot they thought the shot had come from, but they were guessing now. The sound bounced off the hillside, distorted by the angle. Harlow picked a second target. A man firing burst from behind a tree and waited until he made the mistake of leaning out too far. 21. He moved with ruthless efficiency now, no longer simply disrupting an ambush, but actively destroying the team sent to stop him. A third fighter tried to sprint sideways, hoping to break the line of fire. Harlow's bullet caught him mid-stride. 22. The last two went to ground and stayed there, pinned by the knowledge that any motion might be their final one. Harlow could have left them. They were neutralized for the moment, no longer a threat to Harper's withdrawing platoon. But he also knew that once the Americans were gone, once the valley returned to its usual uneasy stillness, those two would stand up, and they would remember. They would teach others how to hunt men like him. He waited, patient as stone, until one of them risked shifting position. The rifle spoke again. 23. The last man refused to move at all, vanishing beneath a tangle of roots and shadow. Harlow tried to pick out a clear shot, but couldn't distinguish anything more than vague shapes. He considered taking a guess, then dismissed it. Ammo was not a luxury. It was a currency he couldn't spend on maybes. He shifted his attention back toward the main tree line. The firefight had almost entirely broken down now into scattered cracks and the occasional isolated burst. Harper's men had reached the rocky outcropping and were using its cover to buy more distance from the original kill zone. They were no longer trapped, they were fighting their way out. Harlow scanned farther along the trees and caught sight of another group of Viet Cong, this one not moving toward the creek or the hillside, but away from both. They were retreating at a trot, glancing back occasionally, frustrated. One man at the rear stopped and turned, raising a pair of binoculars, scanning the slope with obvious anger. Harlow thought he might be an officer, or at least a higher-ranking cadre. His posture was different. His uniform cleaner, his weapon better maintained. Harlow tracked him, adjusted for the distance and the slight breeze that had finally begun to move through the valley, and squeezed. 24. The man dropped, binoculars spinning away. The rest of his group broke into a full run, disappearing into the jungle's deeper shadows. Harlow didn't fire again. They were far, moving fast, and his job, as far as he was concerned, was no longer to tally bodies. It was to make sure his men walked away from this valley. He exhaled, the breath leaving him in a long, slow stream. His hands trembled now that the immediate crisis was fading. He lowered the rifle and rolled onto his back, staring up at the patchwork of sky and leaves overhead. The jungle hummed around him, the sounds of insects and distant birds creeping back in to fill the spaces where gunfire had ruled. Crackle of static sounded near his elbow. He startled, then realized it was his hand radio, half buried in the grass where he'd tucked it at the start of the engagement. He reached for it, thumbed the transmit button, and brought it close to his mouth. "This is Harlow," he said, voice rough from disuse. "How copy?" There was a burst of noise, then Harper's voice came through, thin but clear enough. "Harlow, this is Charlie 2-6. Loud and clear. Was that all you up there?" "It's doing my job, Lieutenant." There was a pause, filled with what might have been disbelief or relief or both. Then Harper spoke again. "Breaking contact and heading for extraction point Bravo. If you can cover our movement a little longer, we'd appreciate it." Harlow let a hint of dry humor slip into his tone. "I've got a few rounds left. I'll make them count." "Copy that," Harper replied. "For the record, Sergeant. We'll talk about what you did today when we're out of this hole." The radio clicked silent. Harlow rolled back onto his stomach and brought the rifle up one more time. The battle was mostly over, but not entirely. Retreats were fragile. All it took was one bold enemy push to turn an organized withdrawal into a rout. He watched the valley with the same patient intensity he'd had at the start, scanning for any sign of resurgence. He saw movement here and there, isolated figures slipping deeper into the trees, carrying wounded or equipment. No coordinated push. No new ambushes being formed. The Viet Cong had lost their advantage. Whatever they had hoped to accomplish today had been shattered by something they hadn't accounted for. A single, old-fashioned rifle in the hands of a man who knew exactly what to do with it. Harlow let the scope drift over the now quieter tree line and wondered. Distantly, how many bodies lay out there among the roots and ferns? He didn't want to count. Not in the way others would later. Confirmed kills. Probable kills. Numbers on a report. For him, the tally meant something simpler. His men had lived. Still, the figure hovered in the back of his mind. 24. He suspected it would not stay that low once everything was added up. The jungle wind shifted again, carrying with it the fading echoes of gunfire and the scent of churned earth and gunpowder. Kahlo remained still, cheek pressed lightly against the worn wood of the rifle, listening to the world settle in uneven breaths. The hillside beneath him felt warmer now as the sun climbed, burning away the thin morning haze. He blinked twice, clearing sweat from his eyelashes, and scanned the valley a final time. Nothing moved except drifting smoke and the slow sway of branches disturbed by retreating bodies long gone. He lowered the rifle and let his muscles relax for the first time in hours. His heartbeat slowed, though not all the way. Combat had a rhythm that didn't stop when the shooting did. It lingered inside the bones, a vibration that stayed long after the danger passed. He rolled onto his side and reached for his canteen, drinking just enough to wet his throat. The water was lukewarm, metallic, but it grounded him. Below, Harper's men continued their withdrawal, small figures weaving between rocks as they moved toward the extraction route. Harlow watched them until the last of the platoon vanished behind the rise. They were alive because the ambush had been broken. Because the ridge had spoken for them when no one else could. Because he had refused to stay in the Valley of Fire. He pushed himself upright slowly, every joint stiff now that adrenaline no longer masked the truth. The rifle hung across his lap, the cracked varnish glinting faintly. A relic, they had called it. A museum piece. It's being outdated and outclassed by the demands of modern war. He ran his thumb along the stock, feeling grooves left by years of handling. To him it was simply a tool, one that had never failed him. He stood and slung the rifle over his shoulder. His legs wobbled at first, protesting the sudden return to weight, but they held. He took one last look at the battlefield. The tree line was a mosaic of stillness and silence now. Somewhere among the roots and brush lay the bodies of men who had come here believing they held the advantage. Men who had never expected a single marksman on a ridge to rewrite the course of the fight. He turned uphill toward the route that would eventually connect him back to Harper's platoon. The climb was slow. Branches snagged his sleeves, vines tugged at his boots, and every step reminded him of how thoroughly he had emptied himself into the hours before. But he kept going, guided less by strength than by the simple fact that the job wasn't done until he stood beside his men again. When he finally crested the ridge and followed the narrow path down toward the rendezvous point, he heard voices ahead, faint at first, then sharper as he approached. Harper appeared from behind a cluster of bamboo, helmet tilted back, sweat streaking his face. The young lieutenant paused when he saw Harlow, his expression shifting from relief to something like awe. "Sergeant," Harper said quietly, "you made it." Harlow nodded once. Words felt unnecessary. Harper stepped closer, lowering his voice so the others couldn't hear. "I don't know how many you got, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to, but without you," he swallowed, "we'd still be down there." Harlow didn't answer. He simply adjusted the strap on his rifle and looked toward the distant helicopter landing zone where the platoon would be lifted away. Harper followed his gaze. "Command's going to want a debrief," Harper said. "They'll want every detail." "They'll get what matters," Harlow replied. "And what's that?" And the platoon walked out. Harper let out a long breath. "You know, they told us that rifle wasn't fit for combat, said it belonged in a warehouse. Or a museum." Harlow's eyes flicked to the weapon at his side. "Maybe it does," he said. "But not today." Harper allowed himself the smallest, tired smile. Today it saved 30 men. Harlow didn't argue. He simply fell into step beside the lieutenant as they moved toward the clearing. The sound of distant rotor blades began to build a low, rhythmic thrum that vibrated through the earth. Extraction was coming. Safety. Time. A chance for the men to breathe again. But even as he walked, Harlow knew the valley behind them would not fade quickly from his mind. The ridge, the rifle, the long minutes between life and death, those things left marks deeper than bullets. They carved themselves into memory, into muscle, into the quiet spaces of a soldier's thoughts. He didn't know then that men in headquarters tens miles away would argue over the numbers, that reports would circulate with phrases like extraordinary marksmanship and single-handed disruption, that someone would eventually write down the tally as 27 confirmed enemy fighters neutralized by one man with a rifle deemed obsolete. He didn't know that some would call it luck or exaggeration or battlefield myth. Others would call it something else entirely, proof that skill and will still mattered in a war that seemed increasingly ruled by technology and overwhelming firepower. He knew only that he had done what the moment required. Nothing more, nothing less. As Harper's platoon boarded the waiting helicopters and the valley receded beneath them, Harlow looked down at the place where the ambush had begun. The tree line was still again, indifferent to what had happened beneath its canopy. The jungle swallowed blood and echoes alike, leaving no sign of the fight that had nearly ended 30 American lives. The helicopter rose higher. Wind whipped through the open doors, carrying the smell of fuel and the sharp tong of metal. Harlow sat with one hand resting on the rifle across his knees, the blade of the horizon cutting cleanly through the morning mist. Harper settled beside him, silent, studying the sergeant the way a man might study something he didn't fully understand but deeply respected. When the helicopter banked north toward their forward base, a thought flickered across Harper's expression. "Sergeant," he finally said, voice raised over the engine roar, "for what it's worth, what you did back there, that's not going to stay quiet." Harlow looked out across the jungle canopy. "It doesn't matter if it does," he said. "I didn't do it to be remembered." "Maybe not," Harper replied, "but you will be." Harlow said nothing more. The wind tore the words away and the jungle fell far behind them. But somewhere deep in the valley they had escaped. The echoes of each measured shot still lingered in the leaves, silent, precise, undeniable. The kind of echoes that eventually grow into legend.